On February 23, 1886, Charles Martin Hall, just 22 years old, passed an electrical current through a chemical solution and changed the world. He had just demonstrated what would be the first commercially viable process to mass produce aluminum, a metal that is so common in the world today that it's hard to imagine life without it. Since that discovery, more than 1.6 billion metric tons of aluminum have been produced, and because it is 100% recyclable, an estimated 75% of that is still in use today. But Hall's discovery, like any scientific discovery, came not in a vacuum, but as part of a long process of scientific development and alongside other inventors. The strange history of aluminum deserves to be remembered. Aluminum today is quite popular. The metal, actually element, is highly versatile, has a high strength-to-weight ratio, and is corrosion-resistant and 100% recyclable. More than 65 million metric tons of primary or new aluminum is produced annually, making it the world's second most popular metal behind steel, while another about a third of the world's aluminum supply is from recycled metal. On face, this shouldn't be surprising. Aluminum is the most common metal to be found in the Earth's crust, and behind oxygen and silicon, the third most abundant element on the planet. Aluminum makes up more than 8% of the Earth's crust by weight, while iron makes up approximately 5%. For being so common and having so much potential use, you would imagine that aluminum would have been well known in antiquity. But it wasn't. There was, by some descriptions, a Copper Age, a Bronze Age, and an Iron Age, but no aluminum age. The reason being, according to the website of Boyd Metals, is that unless you're a chemist with access to a laboratory-controlled environment, the likelihood of you interacting with pure aluminum is slim to none. Simply put, an ancient hoplite would not have stumbled on a piece of aluminum to be molded into a strong but lightweight breastplate. The issue is that aluminum in its pure form is highly reactive with other elements, particularly oxygen, and thus aluminum is generally found naturally bonded in forms of aluminum oxide. Those forms are highly stable, making it difficult to extract the pure metal. That, again, is not unusual. Most metals are found as ores. Aluminum is, however, much more reactive than, say, iron, which counterintuitively is the reason that pure aluminum is corrosion-resistant. The high reactivity means that aluminum bonds more closely to other atoms, commonly oxygen atoms. This high affinity makes aluminum ore particularly stable, meaning that it is more difficult to break the bonds between the aluminum and its oxidized form. Iron can be extracted from iron ore by heating it in a blast furnace with carbon. The carbon burns to create carbon monoxide, which strips oxygen from the iron ore, leaving behind pure liquid iron. This was not a simple process for ancient peoples. Iron ores were collected using picks and hammers. The raw ore was then crushed, washed, and heated in clay and stone bloomery furnaces using charcoal. The result was a spongy mass of iron called a bloom, which was then forged into wrought iron. It was a highly specialized process, but it was quite simple compared to aluminum. Because aluminum is more highly reactive, its bonds to the oxygen are much stronger. Carbon is simply not strong enough to break them, to strip the oxygen from the ore. This problem is compounded by the fact that aluminum has a much higher melting point than iron. If iron was difficult to refine, aluminum was simply beyond the capabilities of ancient societies. That is not to say that aluminum was unknown or unused. Rather, it was used in its oxidized state. Tom Geller, a science and technology writer, writes in the Philadelphia-based Science and History Institute's magazine Distillations that while aluminum metal is a recent discovery, its compounds were fairly common in various industries throughout history. Alum, aluminum potassium sulfate, was best known as a dye fixer, first developed in Egypt over 5,000 years ago, and clays containing aluminum silicates appear to have been favored by contemporary Persian potters for their strength. Anhydrous aluminum sulfate was used by the ancient Greeks as an astringent to staunch wounds, a use that continues to this day in styptic pencils. These characteristics have to do with aluminum's high reactivity, helping, for example, dye to form a permanent bond with plant fiber, or binding to proteins in skin tissues, causing them to contract, shrink, and harden, constricting tissues, effective for stopping minor bleeding and reducing inflammation. These properties were recognized and described by ancient scientists and are mentioned by the 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus, and the 1st century AD Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder and Greek physician Dioscorides. The compounds, generally whitish mineral salts, were generally called alum or alumin. Modern etymologists argue that the name was derived from the ancient Greek word eludoimos, meaning bitter, alum meaning bitter salt, referring to its taste. However, in his 1864 work Aluminium, Its History, Occurrence, Properties, Metallurgy, and Applications, including its alloys, Joseph Richards speculates that the name was derived from the Latin word for light, lumen, which he argues is an allusion to its brightening the colors when used in dyeing. Alum's use in the dye industry made it a critical and lucrative commodity during the Middle Ages. At least by the 8th century, alum, Richards explains, differing from the ancient alum in it contained potassium, was being manufactured rather than simply using the natural substance, although Richards notes that the ancient name continued to be used. But alum continued to be largely a mystery. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, several chemists sought to better understand the nature of alum. In his 2007 work Aluminium, the 13th Element, metallurgist Andrei S. Drozdov writes that chemists long believed that there was some sort of original Earth, and that all the Earths they knew were varieties of it. However, that confidence gradually subsided, since it turned out that each Earth has its own special properties. Thus, chemists started to see some elements in terms of being Earths or soils. Drozdov explains, for example, that the Earths that are somewhat water-soluble came to be called alkali. In 1595, German alchemist Andreas Libavius theorized that alum came from a new or unrecognized earth and proposed calling that soil alumina. In 1760, Theodore Baron de Honville, a member of the French Royal Academy of Sciences, told the Academy that I believe the base of alum to be a metallic nature. Still, he was unable to reduce the base down to a metal, although he said, I think it not too venturesome to predict that a day will come when the metallic nature of the base of alum will be incontestably proven. The attempt to isolate aluminum required more energy than the Baron had at his disposal, but in the early 19th century, scientists began experimenting with electrolysis. Geller explains, generally defined, the process involves applying live electrodes to a liquid containing the compound to be electrolyzed. Electrolysis, Geller writes, would be a process central to the modern history of aluminum. British chemist Humphrey Davy began experimenting with using electrolysis to isolate elements around 1800, and was the first to isolate potassium, sodium, calcium, strontium, barium, magnesium, and boron. But despite repeated efforts, he was unable to isolate aluminum. Still, Geller quotes Norman C. Craig, professor emeritus of chemistry at Oberlin College. Davy had learned enough about compounds of other metals to conclude from the composition of aluminum compounds that they contained a new metal, aluminum. It was Davy that originated the name, or rather names, by which we know the metal today, writing, Had I been fortunate enough to isolate the metal after which I sought, I would have given it the name alumium. Richards explains that in making this suggestion it is perfectly plain that Davy intended this word to represent the metal from alum, simply starting with alum and adding ium as the proper termination. But, Richards writes, objections were very soon thereafter made to this proposed name. Not to the termination ium, which was considered absolutely proper, but to the root or stem of the word. It was maintained by French, German, and Swedish writers that the name of the new metal should be derived from its oxide, and the stem of the word should therefore be alumin. Davy thus changed the proposed name to aluminum. Then, in 1812, Davy settled on aluminium, in order to align with other similar element names like sodium, calcium, and potassium. But in the U.S., Noah Webster had already put the name aluminum into his famous dictionary. The U.S. stuck with the name aluminum. The British and much of the scientific world outside of North America adopted the name aluminium, and that argument continues today. Despite the argument, though, the new metal, by either name, had still not been successfully isolated. In 1825, Hans Christian Ørsted, a professor at the University of Copenhagen, managed to produce a tiny amount of the metal. His process involved rapidly heating aluminum chloride with an alloy of potassium and mercury and then distilling off the mercury. Richards writes, potassium, however, when amalgamated with mercury, is not powerful enough to reduce aluminum chloride, although it can reduce it if used alone, and so Ørsted missed by a very little the honor of first isolating aluminum. In 1827, Frederick Wöhler, a professor of chemistry at the University of Göttingen, used Ørsted's process, but used pure potassium rather than amalgam. He produced a small amount of aluminum powder, but such a small amount that Richards writes he was unable to melt this powder into a button so as to determine its properties en masse. Still, Richards notes, while aluminum had been isolated in 1827, for 18 years its properties en masse were unknown. But battery technology had continued to develop, allowing improved output and reliability. In 1854, Frenchman Henri St. Clair Deville, using largely the same process used by Wohler but with more powerful batteries, was able to produce buttons of nearly pure aluminum. Richardson writes, "The second birth of aluminum, the time at which it stepped from the rank of a curiosity into the number of the useful metals, dates from the labors of Deville in 1854. This almost did not happen, as Richardson explains. Deville was at his time professor of chemistry in the École Normale Paris. His salary was but 3,000 francs. His estate was small, and he was practically without means of doing anything further. But after delivering a paper to the French Academy of Sciences in 1854, funds were placed at his disposal, and Deville gained an important sponsor. Richardson writes, after reading this paper, Deville caused a medal of aluminum to be struck, which he presented to the Emperor, Napoleon III. The latter, looking forward to applying such a light metal to the armor and helmets of the French cuirassiers, immediately authorized experiments to be continued at his own expense on a large scale. The Emperor's desire for aluminum-clad cavalry, Richardson writes, proved impracticable, but Deville was able to refine the process enough that he was able to display an ingot at the 1855 World's Fair in Paris. He received a patent for this process in 1856. In 1859, he published On Aluminium, Its Properties, Its Production, and Its Applications. He was able to build a small factory in a more cost-effective process. Geller writes, lowering its price to a level that allowed ordinary people to afford aluminium jewelry. But Deville failed to spark a revolution. The metal he produced was difficult to work with, and demand was small, while his process had essentially stalled further research as the problem seemed to have been solved. John M. Oskinson wrote in a 1915 edition of the magazine The World's Work that up to 1888 Deville's plant continued to turn out the metal and its manufactures, reaching a maximum production of 5,000 pounds a year. This was practically all converted into small, fancy articles: rings, brooches, statuettes, thimbles, souvenir bars, and wire coils, and was expensive enough to produce that, Geller writes, aluminum largely remained a curiosity for the next 20 years. Aluminum was, in fact, so rare that the U.S. National Park Service writes, by 1884, the year of the Washington Monument's completion under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lincoln Casey, aluminum was still $1.10 an ounce, the same as the then prevailing market price of silver, which was considered a precious metal. The U.S. government wanted to have a precious metal cap for the monument, so it chose aluminum and hired William Frismuth of Philadelphia for the job. Frismuth was the nation's top producer of aluminum at the time, which was a low bar. Geller notes that only 112 pounds of aluminum was produced in the United States in 1884. The cast 6-pound cap for the Washington Monument was, at the time, the single largest piece of aluminum ever cast. It was so precious that Frismuth first displayed it in the window at Tiffany & Company in New York. After the cap was placed, the Park Service writes, Frismuth advertised in the February 28, 1885 Scientific American for customers who wanted an aluminum watch charm at 75 cents, an aluminum alloy charm for 30 cents, and the alloy charm with gilding, also at 30 cents. But the Park Service notes ironically, after all this, on February 23, 1886, less than 2 years after the Washington Monument's completion, a recent graduate from Oberlin College, Ohio, by the name of Charles Martin Hall, discovered the process for making aluminum cheap and commonplace. The road to plentiful aluminum had been long. Literally dozens of important scientists had been involved over a period of centuries in the effort to purify the metal. In the end, the solution would come almost simultaneously from 2 scientists, each just 22 years of age. Born December 6, 1863, Charles Martin Hall's father, Herman Bassett Hall, was an 1847 graduate of Ohio's Oberlin College. A brilliant student, Theodore Beck writes in a 2014 edition of Interface, a journal of the Electrochemical Society, that by the age of 6 he was reading his father's 1840s college chemistry book. Born April 10, 1863, in a suburb of Paris, Paul Heroult was the son of a tanner, but he was also a proficient student. Beck writes that his father had a friend, Mr. Beloy, a lawyer with a magnificent personal library where Heroult spent hours reading science, research, and discovery. A particular interest was a work by St. Clair Deville on aluminum, its properties, production, and applications, which he read when he was 15 years old. Both young men developed an interest in improving the process to refine aluminum. Maurice Lepere explains Hall's interest in the 2012 work The Aluminium False Twins, published by the Institute for the History of Aluminium. In 1880, Charles Hall was a student at the Oberlin College, Ohio, where Professor Frank Fanning Jewett was teaching chemistry. During the years 1874 and 1875, Frank Jewett had studied chemistry at the University of Göttingen in Germany, where he had met Friedrich Wöhler. As he later recalled during a class reunion at Yale University, he had brought a small piece of aluminum and showed it to his students. If anyone should invent a process by which aluminum could be made on a commercial scale, not only would he be a benefactor to the world, but would also be able to lay up for himself a great fortune. Turning to a classmate, Charles Hall said, "I'll be that man." Meanwhile, Heroult entered the National School of Mines in Paris. He did not, however, thrive on academics. Rather, he was obsessed with another goal: to invent a cost-effective way to mass-produce aluminum. In 1881, he wrote to his mother, "I have to dedicate all of my time to work on my project, for fear that someone else might discover before me the process I am trying to develop, without enough time for school. Today, the cost to the manufacturer is 60 francs per kilo. I could sell it for 8 francs, and with the use of hydraulic power, the cost would be 4 francs. You must see how important that kind of business can be." Both young men went on to experiment. Hall in the woodshed at his family home, assisted by his sister Julia, who had also studied chemistry. Heroult in the tannery workshop. But Lepara notes that the two young men were very different. Charles M. Hall was a scientist and a chemist from the Oberlin College. He focused on the chemical component of the problem. On the contrary, Paul Heroult was not a chemist. He was rather an imaginative experimenter, and through the year he spent at the École des Mines in Paris, he became more technology-oriented. Through these different approaches, both came to a similar breakthrough. By dissolving alumina in molten cryolite, electrolysis could be done at practical temperatures. It's unclear exactly when Heroult came upon the discovery. Beck writes that his inventions appeared suddenly, out of the blue, but he was able to apply for a patent in France on April 23, 1886. Hall produced the first aluminum from his process on February 23 the same year and applied for a patent in the U.S. on July 9, 1886, only to find out that Heroult had previously been granted the French patent for a comparable process. Hall was able to provide evidence, including postmarked letters, that allowed him to establish the priority of his discovery to the U.S. Patent Office. He obtained his U.S. patent in 1889. The Hall and Heroult patents were an example of an almost simultaneous discovery through different means by two young men who were in some ways surprisingly similar, but others very different. In his 2011 paper, The Race for Cheap Aluminum, Hall versus Heroult, Dean F. Martin of the University of South Florida Chemistry Department writes, "Charles Martin Hall, an American, and Paul Louis Toussaint Heroult, a Frenchman, had parallel lives." But Lepara notes, but in spite of their similar careers, Hall and Heroult were absolutely different men, with different natures, educations, attitudes, and behaviors. Although, as Geller correctly notes, their nearly simultaneous discovery of a process for aluminum extraction was built on several decades' worth of electrochemistry, and indeed centuries' worth of knowledge on the nature of metals. In the end, the two became friends. Hall's patents held sway in the U.S., Heroult's in Europe. The process would become known as the Hall-Heroult process. Martin writes that in 1911, when Hall received the Perkin Medal of the American Chemical Society, the highest award of the society, Dr. Heroult came from France to be present and made a contribution to the tributes. The process eventually resulted in reducing the price of aluminum by a factor of 200, making it affordable for many practical uses. Geller writes, "Today, aluminum is a critical component of modern life, found in airplanes, automobiles, soft drink cans, construction materials, cooking equipment, guardrails, and countless other products. The difference between scarcity and abundance, and between obscurity and ubiquity of this metal depended solely on scientists' ability to find a way to release it, the third most common element in the Earth's crust by weight, from its ore." This brief history couldn't even come close to listing the perhaps hundreds of scientists who made meaningful contributions to the centuries-long process of unleashing the world's reserves of what the Aluminum Association refers to as the miracle metal: infinitely recyclable, military-grade strength, corrosion-resistant, lightweight versatility, and energy-efficient. But it is strange that after all that long process, the culmination would fall on not one, but two young men who led such parallel lives. Both men would go on to become fabulously wealthy for inventing the process of refining aluminum. Both men would go on to invent many more things. Hall would receive 22 patents in his lifetime. Heroult would become doubly famous as the inventor of the electric arc furnace, which is used in steel production. And to make sure that their lives remained parallel, both men died in the same year. Paul Heroult passed away on May 9th, 1914. Charles Martin Hall passed away on December 21st. Both men dying just barely a month after their 51st birthdays. Oskinson writes, for America, Charles Martin Hall, a round-headed, quiet, boyish-looking worker, opened up the door upon the new age of aluminum. To Europe, Paul Heroult revealed it. There is credit enough in the achievement for both. They shared it, like gallant rivals. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.